Stapleton Roy. I'm the director of the Kissinger Institute on China and the United States here at the Wilson Center. And we, together with the Cold War International History Project, are sponsoring this book discussion this morning. For those of you who are not familiar with the Wilson Center, I'll just remind you that we were created by Congress in 1968 as a living memorial to the only American president who was a scholar and had a doctorate. The purpose of the Wilson Center is to try to bring together the worlds of scholarship and of public policy. Our discussion today is focused on a topic which couldn't be a better fit to what we try to do here at the Wilson Center. The issue of nationalism in China has an enormous relationship to China's foreign policy. And it is not well understood. Does China seek to encourage nationalism? Does the government of China seek to encourage nationalism as a way of enhancing its legitimacy? Or is it afraid of nationalism? Because nationalism in China has historically turned against the government when it doesn't behave in ways that the nationalistic sentiments in China think are proper. It's a very complex issue. It's also a subject that is very much in debate in China now. For 30 years of reform and openness, the guiding precepts have been Deng Xiaoping's concept that China should keep a low profile and not grasp for international leadership. And yet now nationalism in China is stirring up the view that China needs a foreign policy that is commensurate with its international standing. And in the work report that has not yet been released, but only in excerpts, that concept is linked to China's military development, where there's a phrase about China needs a strong military commensurate with the country's international standing and suitable for its defense needs and the needs of the national development. So this concept of commensurate with national standing, international standing, is a reflection of growing Chinese nationalism. Dr. Wang, who has produced this fascinating book, Never Forget National Humiliation, has been studying this issue as a scholar for many years. He is now a public policy scholar here at the Wilson Center. He's been a senior fellow at the U.S. Institute of Peace. He's an associate professor at Seton Hall University in New Jersey. He has been associated with universities and think tanks in China. He's widely published on this area. I'm looking forward with great anticipation to your comments this morning, Dr. Wang, and I think we'll have plenty of time for questions and discussion. Dr. Wang.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Roy. It's really my honor to have you hosting my presentation, and also I'm very grateful to have the opportunity to be a residential scholar at Wilson Center. I enjoy very much my time here. And good morning, and thank you, everybody. It's really my great pleasure to report to you my research, and thank you for coming on such a raining day. Maybe I stand up because I'm a professor. I get used to talk when I stand up. As you know, can you hear me?
Yes. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. As you know, my presentation today is based on my new book. The book was published by Columbia University Press just a few months ago. And for those of you who have been working with university press, you know that how long their production pipe can be. So it's a new book, but for me, it's a project I have already completed a few years ago. So when it was published, I was happy, but for me, I think it's a project I have already done. And also for scholars, I believe you understand, when we do some research, we were never really expecting that something like when you walk on the street, you will run into your research, right? But just let me share you a story of mine. I did run into my research in China this September. You know, the September was a very bad month for China-Japan relationship. The bilateral relationship almost collapsed because of the Diaoyu Senkaku issue. I happened to be in China during that period of time, and I was in Xuzhou. It's a quite small city actually in China, in Jiangsu province. So I heard about the demonstration in Beijing and Shanghai, but I never thought I were really, you know, there would be demonstration in Xuzhou. But on September 16, I walked with my wife and my daughter at the central park of the Xuzhou, and I saw that some young people, they looks like college students, they gathering from the different directions, they are holding flags, banners, and they soon formed a large crowd of people, and they began to march around the central park. And suddenly, I heard them, they began to shout together some slogans. First, I heard about something like boycott Japanese products, and suddenly I heard them shouted together, 勿忘国耻, which we translate into English is never forget national humiliation. At that moment, I suddenly realized, oh, it's the title of my book I just published. So this is the thing I have seen. They're holding the banner, if I translate into Chinese English, is boycott Japanese products, never forget national humiliation. Recover Diaoyu Island. I was really kind of at that moment when people shouted these scholars. And also, my daughter, she's only 5 years old. And you know, she's growing up in the United States, so her Chinese is not that good. She speaks Chinese, but not that good. So she asked me, Daddy, what they talk about? What they shouted? And I just repeat, I said, 勿忘国耻. But she said, what does that mean? And I realized that it's like impossible for me to explain to her what is never forget national humiliation. And I also think it's probably something she should never know. But this is a picture taken in 2005. You know, in 2005, there's also a major anti-Japan demonstration because of the textbook issues. And you see this little girl, I think she's just several years older than my daughter, and she's using a brush pen writing this phrase on her daddy's car. She seems to understand quite well about the meaning of this phrase. And this is actually September 17th. The next day, I saw the Xuzhou demonstration. A group of students in Anhui province, they signed their name at this big banner. It's also never forget national humiliation. And this group of young students, they are listening to the survivor of the September 18 incident in Shenyang. That was the date in 1931 when Japan invaded Shenyang. And you say this big bell, and the same phrase was here. And if you Google this phrase in the website, you can find thousands of the pictures. And you can say this emotional young people put this phrase on his face. And this policeman, they use their body to firm these 4 characters, never forget national humiliation. I also used a photo as the cover image of my book. A group of students pledge in front of the camera, and they have the blackboard, which is never forget national humiliation, strengthen our national defense. In this book, I refer this phrase as a national phrase of China. Somehow, I argue in this book, this is the key thing to understand Chinese nationalism. When we study Chinese nationalism, we cannot only just study these demonstrations. We should try to find the cultural, historic foundation of Chinese nationalism. And I believe understanding this phrase is the key. And somehow, what this book trying to do is to provide explanation of what I have seen in Xuzhou. Basically, is those people, these kids, they are too young to really experience the so-called national humiliation. Why they have such strong and emotional connections with this phrase? And also, how do we understand, like my Japanese friends ask me, the Diaoyu issue, that this national purchases happened in September 2012. Why these people, like the people holding the banner in Xuzhou, they related a current issue with something long, long ago? And how do we understand the factor of national humiliation in Chinese politics and foreign relations? So basically, my book is trying to answer these kind of questions. I just want to quickly review what exactly is national humiliation. In any country, they have some special national experience. People of their citizens, they will be, they always remember. But for the Chinese, their historic consciousness is strongly influenced by the concept of the century of national humiliation, which is basically from starting of the Opium War to the end of the anti-Japanese war of resistance, the Second World War. So during this period of time, the Chinese, one of the very important things for us to understand is that we have to understand this is a group of people. They are actually very proud of themselves. They believe they are the central kingdom. They believe their civilization is somehow, a splendid civilization. They are very proud of it. And during this period of time, they suffered some, which very, it's like the darkest period of time in their history. China was invaded by foreign powers, and also a very important narrative in this national humiliation narrative is unequal treaties. They believe because during this period of time, China was weak, so the foreign powers took advantage of the weak China, and they somehow forced China to sign a large group of treaties, which they called unequal treaties. They believe there's over 100 treaties. So I just listed here very briefly 3 of them, like Treaty of Nanjing, the first unequal treaties, and also the Treaty of 1895, which is actually until now, it's still something. For example, one of the articles of the treaty is China should cede to Japan Liaodong and Taiwan and several of the islands, and China and Japan still arguing about whether Diaoyu Senkaku is one or is among these islands. So that is the narrative of national humiliation in China. It's also very interesting is that sometimes when people talk about this humiliation narrative, many people will somehow think this is something started from the Communist Party, which actually was wrong. The national humiliation narrative is actually being used for a long time before the Communist Party came into power. This picture is actually a photocopy of Chiang Kai-shek. He was the Chinese leader during the Second World War. His diary. He got a habit is writing diary every day for a long, long time. And since 1928, he began to do one thing, is every day when he wrote his diary, he will put on the right corner, it's like a reminder of the most important thing for the day, the two Chinese characters, 雪耻, which we translate into English is wiping clean humiliation or wiping out humiliation. And he wrote these two Chinese characters in his diary for almost 2 decades. Every day, he did the same thing. When he wrote his diary, he wrote these two characters at the right corner of his diary. And so in my book, I actually talked quite a lot about how Chiang Kai-shek, how Sun Yat-sen, they use the humiliation as a tool to mobilize people. Sun Yat-sen used to say, he said, I'm the director of awakening, because they believe at that time in the late Qing, and people, the ordinary people, they focus on their daily life, they survive for their daily life, so they have to awakening to ask them to join the revolution. So he said, I'm the director of awakening. And the main tool, the main components of their awakening material is actually about national humiliation, about the cancellation of unequal treaties. So if you go back to some of the old documents of nationalist party, you can find a lot of this kind of national humiliation discourse. And then, actually, it's also very interesting, is after 1949, after the Communist Party came into power, and you will find suddenly this kind of narrative discourse of national humiliation stopped. One of my friends, Dr. Callahan, he conducted research about this factor, and he found that he conducted some research in the National Library of China, and he found from 1949 until 1990, during this long period of time, there's no single book published in China using the title of national humiliation. And the reason is Chairman Mao, he doesn't like the humiliation narrative. He is kind of the master of the wicked narrative. And also another very important reason is that for the Communist Party, they use the class struggle theory rather than and also their legitimacy is not based on the ending, at that time, I mean after 1949, based on the ending of China's national humiliation, but based on the Chinese Revolution. So according to this theory, China's decline and suffering in modern history were caused mainly by the internal corruption and the incompetence of these rulers, the Qing court and the nationalistic KMT. So foreign invasions became kind of a secondary factor in explaining China's traumatic national experience. And Mao also believed historic grievance based on ethnicity was kind of like a narrow nationalism. So which is actually very ironically, this is a picture, it's during this September anti-Japanese protest. If you look at the website, you can say a lot of cities, these people, they are holding the portrait of Chairman Mao. Actually, Chairman Mao never been the anti-Japan hero. During the most of time, the China's anti-Japan war, he and his party was just hiding in Shanxi province. They didn't do much work. So, but that means these young people, they know some history, but they don't know a lot of other histories really happened in China. And then the things changed again. After the 1989 students' movement, especially after the collapse of the Communist Party in East Europe and Soviet Union, the Chinese Communist Party now facing a major crisis. It's a crisis of face of socialism and communism. It's also a crisis of people never trust the Communist Party. And a lot of people at that time believe this regime will collapse soon. So end this crisis, the party, they must find something to hold people together, to hold the country together, and also basically to solve their basic crisis of legitimacy. Their legitimacy used to be based on Chairman Mao, based on revolution, but now it's no longer useful. So actually, only several days after the crackdown of the students' movement, Deng Xiaoping, when he met with these generals of the troops they cracked down the students, he said his reflection about why the students' movement happened. He said, our biggest mistake was in the field of education. We didn't tell enough about the need for hard struggle and what China was like in the old days. So he actually asked the party to do something to kind of like to conduct somehow kind of a history education reform. And the new Secretary General of this party, Jiang Zemin, he actually worked very actively to conduct this reform. So in my book, I call it Jiang Zemin's Patriotic 10. Today, when people conduct research of, especially about Jiang Zemin's period of time, I think most scholars focus his economic reform, joining of WTO, foreign policy, 3 representatives, but rather a lot of scholars overlooked this. I think is a very important activities he conducted to transfer the ideology of the party, to transfer the legitimacy of the party. So in 1991, he formally instructed his education minister to conduct the what's so-called the patriotic education campaign. And he said that we should do this education even to the kids in kindergarten. And in my book, I have a quite detailed discussion about the processes of this patriotic education campaign. A major part of this is that they conducted a major kind of revision of the history textbooks. In the new history textbooks, the old class struggle narrative will be replaced by the patriotic narrative. So it's no longer, for example, the explanation about the war between China and Japan is no longer between the ruling class and the grassroots, the ordinary people, but the emphasis was put on the ethnic conflict between the two countries. And also, very importantly, they replaced the old victor narrative to the victimization narrative. So in the new history textbook, in a lot of literature, books, films published during this period of time, you can say why was the kids in the 1970s, I have never read this kind of the details of the war violence. So a lot of the very detailed description of the war violence. And also, it's kind of new narrative. In the past, the students, they will study Chinese history, world history in the secondary school. But now, the modern and contemporary Chinese history became a required core course in the high school since 1992. So core course means that they make sure they have a longer coursework, and they also issued the official teaching guideline that makes sure that all the schools in China, they have to follow in the same way of teaching this course. In recent years in China, the schools can somehow select the different textbooks. But in the 1980s, 1990s, at that time, almost all the schools in China, they use the uniformed textbooks published by, for example, the People's Education Press. So they use the same textbook the whole country. So they make sure that all the kids study the same kind of, they get the same kind of information. And also very importantly, the party also somehow, they realized in the past, many of their propaganda campaigns were not that successful, was not that very effective. So this way, they changed the methods, the approaches they conduct this ideological campaign. So they actually trying to somehow to make sure it's not only just, actually the history textbook is only a small part of the patriotic education campaign. They want to make sure that people can be kind of nurtured, they use the word, influenced and nurtured by the patriotic thoughts and spirit all times and everywhere in their daily life. So they asked the artists, the filmmakers, the writers, they all write on the patriotic topic. And what they called is the mainstream. And they also conducted the activities, what they called the 3-100. They asked these people to write 100 patriotic songs, 100 movies, and 100 literature, novels, all different kind of essays on the mainstream. I just used the poster of the several movies being produced during this period of time, all focus on Nanjing massacre. And I conducted research actually during this period of time. There are over 10 movies being produced focused on rape of Nanjing. This is just 5 of them. And so think about that. For these young people in China, even this is something happened long time ago. But these movies, they played an important role to keep the memory fresh. And it's like something happened not long ago. Even many of the students, they probably don't know much about the students' movement in 1989, but they know all the details about rape of Nanjing. My Japanese friends asked me, they just couldn't understand why the Chinese were so angry and why they related with the current issue with something happened a long time ago. I think these are some of the answers. Think about if you're growing up every day, even I believe many of the Chinese students, they know many of this, they are government propaganda. But you think about you are growing up every day, you turn on the TV, you watch this kind of thing, and if you go on the street, in many of the corners of the cities, you can see some of the monuments, some of the museums, and everything is plays a role trying to activate people's memory or giving people this kind of information. And they also conducted the major activities, what is called to construct the patriotic education basis, which is mainly the museums, monuments. And this is the museum in Shenyang, the September 18, like I mentioned before, the date, 1931, the date when the Japanese invaded Shenyang. And they made this sculpture or the monument looks like an open calendar. The basic idea is never forget. And I don't know whether you can guess what this is. Yeah, it's Opium War. It's in Guangdong. It's in Jiangmen, and It's actually the place the Opium War happened. This is a broken opium pipe. When people, they smoke opium, they use this kind of pipe. And so there are two, I read this introduction, and it's they're saying there's two mighty hands broken this opium pipe, and it shows the determination of Chinese people. So all, in my book, I actually used quite some of these pictures. When I visited China, I went to these memory sites. And they also, not only just the students, but this is a group of, in China recent years, they have a very important accomplishment is this fast train, express train. These are staff members of the fast train. And I believe this is youth league organized these people to go to the memorial hall of the rape of Nanjing to receive kind of the education. And they pledge there. And you can say this is also another way they made this kind of monument. In the front door of this monument, you can say this, the huge, in 3 languages, victims 300,000. It's like a statement, because there's controversy regarding the numbers. And I believe you heard a lot about the people sing the so-called red songs. And it's funny enough, they even have these monks and nuns to sing this patriotic songs to praise the anniversary of the Chinese Communist Party. So this is a major change of the, like I mentioned, that after the May 4th movement, 1919, nationalism has been a main topic or main theme in the Chinese Revolution and supported actually Chinese Revolution. And it stopped after Chinese Communist Party came into power. And then suddenly, after this party was in crisis, in early 1990s, they turned back to this humiliation narrative. And I just want to mention briefly that one of the main misunderstanding about my research is somehow about, whether you just use this grievance to explain why Chinese are unhappy with the West. Because in many of the, not only China, in many of the former post-colonial states, this is actually quite common because of this kind of historic grievance. People have certain kind of the attitude or sentimental toward the Western countries. But actually in my book, what I'm trying to do is that I'm trying to conduct a systematic research about how this narrative of national humiliation play a major role as the national identity formation. What kind of role they played in defining some questions like for Chinese, like who are Chinese? What does that mean to be a Chinese? Who are our enemies? Who are our friends? What kind of mission we have? What kind of goal we want to achieve? And I believe the humiliation narrative played a major role during these processes. And also, Jiang Zemin also conducted a major kind of reconstruction of his party. And I don't have time to go very detailed, but in my book I have a detailed discussion about how the party, after 1989, they used the humiliation narrative or historic memory, kind of rewrote their constitution. For example, what's the membership of the Communist Party? The formal, we're all familiar with, they define themselves as the vanguard of the Chinese working class. But after that, in Jiang Zemin's speech, Communist Party became the firmest, the most thoroughgoing patriot. And also, the legitimacy used to based on Chairman Mao, or the only Communist Party can save China, something like that, liberation. but now is that we have thoroughly ended the history of humiliating diplomacy. And only the Communist Party can rejuvenate China. And also their mission, the old mission used to be the triumph of socialism, realization of communism, but now it becomes that making our country rejuvenated to end of the state of separation, reunification of China. In my book, I also talks about that Hu Jintao, he will probably step down very soon. And actually, you find this very interesting. In almost each of his open public speech, many of them, he ended by using this sentence: let's strive together for the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation. That is the phrase he likes to use most. He always ending his speech by putting this sentence. So basically, because I'm a scholar of international relations, the reason I'm interested in this research is we believe if we're trying to understand China, we cannot just conduct some research about how many nuclear weapons, how many submarine carriers China has. The more important for us is to understand their intentions. And to understand their foreign policy, we have to understand their national interest. And we know that the national identity is the constructing material or the most important thing to determine the national interest. And the national interest, in turn, determines the foreign policy and state actions. So that's the reason I believe doing research on the historical memory will play the important role for us to understand also China's foreign policy. So now let's talk about how this understanding the processes of the humiliation discourse can help us to understand Chinese nationalism. One of the arguments in this book is that I believe Chinese nationalism is actually not really based on religion, ethnic, or even not based on ideology, but it's really based on such a very strong, we can say, a myth-trauma complex. It's based on the strong historic consciousness people have. They have such kind of a very special and strong historic consciousness. And this consciousness is based on national humiliation, but we have to understand that it's actually a very special complex of myth trauma. They're proud of themselves. Today, many people ask me this question, whether success will providing some healing. Because today China is no longer a weak country. It's a strong country. So whether the success provides some healing, but actually, I will say that today's accomplishments, today's success, somehow became a part of this complex. They are very proud of not only the ancient civilization, including some of their current, recent accomplishment. And this recent accomplishment very often played the role to reactive people's historic consciousness regarding that part of the bad time. And there's even stronger determination of wiping out humiliation. And that's the reason when the whole world, when we're talking about China, people use the word rise, China's rise. But the Chinese people, they don't use the word rise. They use another word, rejuvenation. It's not the same. Rise is not, they use the word 复兴, rejuvenation. It's not that they are rising from nothing. It's they go back, restore to their old positions. And also another question people always debate about is whether Chinese nationalism is top-down. That means the government manipulated, or it's bottom-up. In this book, I actually talked all the three different approach, like primordial approach. Like I talked about, for example, Chiang Kai-shek. His former wife was, and the mother of Jiang Jingguo, the president of Taiwan, was killed during the Japanese, air raid target his hometown. And I talked about Premier Wen Jiabao's story. Premier Wen Jiabao liked to introduce himself by mentioning about his childhood war memory and how his grandfather's primary school, his grandfather is the master of the primary school, was burned by the Japanese troops. And also from the social constructivist approach about the history textbook, history education, and the elites instrumentalist approach like the patriotic education campaign. One of my argument, I think it doesn't make sense to argue whether Chinese nationalism is either top-down or bottom-up. I believe all the three approaches, they play some role. They can work together. And also, I make the argument that for those people, they believe kind of nationalism is kind of like the official nationalism or state nationalism. We cannot forget about a state nationalism is normally always depend on the degree of the social nationalism shared by all the citizens. If not, the Chinese people have such kind of a strong historic consciousness, it's impossible this patriotic education campaign can be somehow successful, can be effective, because they're so kind of shared by the peoples, so they can use it. And I also argued in this book, I don't believe the Chinese communist leaders, they are just cool-headed, cold-hearted rationalists. They just simply use historic issues or national humiliation as a rationalist to mobilize people, just to use them as tools. From the stories of Wen Jiabao, from the stories of other leaders, they are also believing what they said. Because this is something, even we talks about in the Chinese history textbooks, they didn't give a full picture. Many of the stories are biased. Many of the stories are one-sided, but they are not made up. Many of the things they displayed in the museums or they used as this education campaign are not something, a story totally made up or something they just created by themselves. It's also based on the historic truth. For example, in China, over 900 Chinese cities has been occupied by Japan. So each of the cities, they have a lot of memory during the wartime. And especially this patriotic education campaign played a very important role to reactive people's memory about that part of the history. And also, the reason we explain the party turned back to the nationalism, we can say is actually it's a failure for them to create what they call the new China, not based on nationalism, not based on humiliation, based on communism or socialism. That was a total failure. So they have to turn back. And another argument about the Chinese nationalism is that whether Chinese nationalism is somehow is mainly government launched, manipulated for the internal reasons, or which is kind of like a response to the Western or foreign pressures. I would say it's actually both. You can say the both reasons. I believe in 1992, when the Chinese Communist Party started the patriotic education campaign, I don't think they have a very sophisticated plan. They're just trying to find something, trying to fill the problems of the spiritual vacuum. But later on, they found it's quite kind of like effective. So the main purpose for this go back to nationalism for this party, I believe, is for the domestic reason. They want to use nationalism or humiliation narrative to put people together, to increase the social cohesion. But a byproduct somehow is that, think about these young people, this generation of patriotic education. They're growing up by receiving this information. So their mentality, their attitude, their worldview cannot be, free being influenced by this education. And also, the government, now they found themselves in a dilemma. Due to this deep-seated historic grievance, and the government now they found themselves, they have a little flexibility in foreign policy. They have to be tough and aggressive, especially with Japan. Really, I think many people, they overlooked the seriousness of the recent tension between China and Japan. For China, for Chinese government, they have very little room to step by. They have to be tough and aggressive. Otherwise, they will not pass domestic, people's domestic attitude. And also, they will lose their legitimacy because based on their new legitimacy narrative, it's based on we ended up the humiliating diplomacy. And that is the most important thing for them. So they have to be tough and aggressive. And also because of all this narrative, being tough, being aggressive, kind of have moral and ethnical justification. The people somehow, it's also very interesting. Outside China, when people talk about today's China's foreign policy, people like to use the word assertive, aggressive. But inside China, the majority Chinese people actually criticize the government being too soft, too weak. I think this gap of perception is because of the education, the historic issues. And also, in my book, I talks about what kind of factors can play the role of activate Chinese historic memory. And I found these three special reasons like emergency, accident or unexpected events, bombing of the embassy, spy plane, incidents that involve the Chinese suffering, bombing of the embassy, dispute with a country that has historical problems with China, like Japan and the United States. They had some bad memories. This is sometimes very important reasons activate the people's historic memory. And also, historic memory sometimes play the role as a roadmap or focal points. Very often in the crisis situation or confrontation, historic memory can serve as a major motivating factors. So think about if there's a major confrontation or there's an incident between, accident between China and Japan. I believe this kind of, in such kind of situations can be very dangerous because historic memory can play the role as a roadmap and guiding people what to do. And also, I just make the final point is about between globalism and nationalism. And I think the Chinese government currently, they are in a major dilemma between globalism and nationalism. It's actually in the past 3 decades, Chinese government actually they embraced globalism. China became a world factory. China opening the doors. And actually, we can also say China somehow beneficial most from the process of the globalization. Globalization opened the door for China to be a much wealthy country, to be a much stronger country. But at the same time, the government currently they are in the dilemma between the globalism and the nationalism. And one of my explanations about the recent anti-Japan protest is that I found it's very much resemble of the bombing of the embassy in 1999. The government permitted, assisted, and took advantage of the public demonstration. And the main purpose for them is trying to get the Chinese anger out and stealing the response outward, avoid a domestic backlash. They kind of doing it in a very skillful way. And I found it's really, these two incidents is very resemble. So I always talk with my Japanese friends that I really hope the recent demonstration won't be misunderstood in Japan. Because I can think if I'm a Japanese, if I see these pictures, I see these banners, the banners, many of the cities, the banners have the language somehow like calling for a nuclear war against Japan, or even some very bad language, they just put it on their slogans. This is not real kind of it's not the real Chinese general public's attitude towards Japan. It's only a very small group of people. It's the extreme, and it's not can be used really as the basis to understand Chinese nationalism. And also, the reason I said there's a dilemma between globalism and nationalism is that the Chinese leaders, they have to be responsive to domestic pressure. And they found themselves, it's difficult for them to use a professional way in dealing with foreign policy issues. And the new leadership, on Thursday, we will know who are among this new leadership, the political bureaus. They will end the direct pressure is that there's a stronger voice at home calling for tougher foreign policy and support taking actions over the South China Sea and the Diaoyu Senkaku issue. So they will end the pressure. And so in a recent article I wrote, I'm talking about that there is a higher possibility for the new leadership, they may adopt a nationalistic policy. Because even they know China, beneficial most from the globalism. But they have this kind of huge, because China have so many domestic troubles from the Bolshevik case, internal power struggles. This is a very special movement of China. So that is a dilemma between globalism and nationalism. I just, by making a conclusion is that people talking about that for different countries, they have kind of national ideas. The idea of national ideas is that collective beliefs of the society and organization about how to act. I believe for different countries, they have different kind of national ideas. I don't know what is national idea for America. But I'm arguing in this book that for the Chinese, the national humiliation, the historic memory is kind of play the role as national ideas. Although, very often, even you talk with people, you won't feel that. They play some role as unconsciously but profoundly influence people's perceptions and actions. Somehow it's like I'm wearing these glasses. Each of us, I believe we're wearing invisible glasses. Through this kind of framework, our cultural, our identity framework, we interpret incoming information. But we have to know, for the Chinese people, very important thing in their invisible lenses is this kind of historic consciousness. So I will stop here. I believe I probably used it longer than I should. I'm sorry, and I welcome your questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Wong, for a fascinating presentation. It raises some really big issues, which we can explore along with a lot of other subjects in the question period. One of the issues, of course, is this use of nationalism essentially pushing China onto the same path that other rising powers have pursued, in which nationalism, tough, aggressive foreign policies have been an integral part of their process of rising, and the recent historical precedents suggest that this is a dangerous course. The second question is, how does this use of nationalism fit with the concept of peaceful development or peaceful rise? Because once again, a tough, aggressive nationalism is less likely to make it easy for China to rise peacefully. And the third issue that went through my mind as I was listening to your presentation is the relationship between nationalism, which is focused on the country, as opposed to the loyalty to the party. In a sense, the party is being trapped because China has the military with its primary loyalty to the party rather than to the country. But if the nationalism sees the party as not being sufficiently assertive in defending China's national interests, then nationalism tends to turn against the party and not simply against the government. And that, in a sense, Jiang Zemin's effort to treat the party as being the embodiment of patriotism is an effort to deal with that problem, but it doesn't solve the problem. And that issue could also emerge in terms of the legitimacy of the party as the guiding force behind the government and the policies. In any event, these are some of the big issues that went through my mind, but why don't we open up the floor to questions from the audience. There are microphones here. Are there not? Yes. Could we start over here? And please identify yourself and hopefully keep the questions relatively short.
Question short. Doug Norton, I'm a local contractor. One quick question. This cuts two ways. China, of course, is not entirely homogeneous. There are minority groups across China for which this argument plays very well against the Chinese state and party. How do they tend to grapple with that, and what are the prospects for this increasing dissent, for example, in Tibet and Xinjiang?
Yeah, it's a very good question, and I think for the party, when they conduct the patriotic education campaign, they also trying to put this minority group into this kind of national narrative. They especially made efforts to create this kind of idea is that it's a big China, and they have a lot of songs trying to including, making this country, including from, the Tibet, Xinjiang, everything put, especially the minority, into this concept of big China. So they hope to include that, to make even the minority to feel that, this is also a part of their humiliation. This is also, like the national rejuvenation is also the common goal of all Chinese. But actually, in my book, I mentioned another thing is that I called it the one country, two memories. That they are not really sharing these memories for the Tibetans, for Uyghurs. They have their own memory. And also a lot of memories, actually, the bad memories about the Chinese invasion. The bad memories about the suffering during the Chinese rule. So that is a major challenge to China. And I can tell you a story. I participated some dialogue programs between the Chinese young people and the Taiwanese young people. because my field is conflict resolution. So I played the role as a facilitator for this youth dialogue program. And it was last year in Hong Kong. So we have the students from, graduate students from Chinese University, Hong Kongese University, and Taiwanese University who have the dialogue programs. So we talked about something about the students' movement in 1989. And to my big surprise, the Chinese students, they are from the elite University of China. They know very little about this students' movement. Why I told them I'm a participant of the students' movement because I was a college student in 1989. And I never thought I made them nervous. And they go back secretly, Google my name. And because I left China for so long and I haven't really, made much of my name on the Chinese website, so they couldn't find my name. So they began to worry about I'm not on the blacklist of the Chinese government. And later on, I know that. I said that, how could you think this way? And I know that they know nothing about the students' movement, even it's only 20 years ago. I told them that if your parents or if you have any people, experienced that, you know that at that time in Beijing, almost 99% of the students participated in this movement. If each of them on the blacklist would be too long and doesn't make any sense. But they don't know even about that. But interestingly, students in Hong Kong knowing everything about the students' movement. Because every year in Hong Kong, there's activities to memorize the June 4th movement. So students in Hong Kong knowing about that. So that is very interesting of one country, two memories in the not only minority groups, but including Hong Kong and Taiwan. Thank you.
Let's go over here. Yes?
Elizabeth Pond, World Policy Journal. This was a fascinating talk. I have all sorts of questions, but I'll just ask one question, which is kind of a follow-on to what Mr. Roy asked. And that is, it's a policy question. It goes beyond what you've been studying, but you obviously have been thinking about, or you must have been thinking about this. Pretend that you are Henry Kissinger today, and you want to find a strategic concept that will bring China and the United States into the same framework. At that point, Kissinger and Zhou Enlai could make this formulation on the basis of realpolitik. The implication of what you're saying is that the two countries are totally talking past each other at this point with totally different frameworks. The U.S. a kind of realpolitik framework, and the Chinese with the framework that you've been giving us. So, if you were Kissinger today, what would you see as the commonality that could bring you together, both in terms of policy and in the kind of international institutions, Asian institutions that you would need to carry it out?
Mm-hmm. Yes, it's a very good question, and of course I'm not Kissinger, but I believe this is very important because actually my new project at Wilson Center is writing a new book about the China-U.S. relationship, and it's especially focused the current mutual strategic suspicion between each other. The two countries, they don't believe each other. But we have to say this is also a very interesting phenomena, is that in China, of course we talk about this is something, it's difficult to, if we talk about the foundation, the basis, especially cultural foundation for the two countries, for the two superpowers, somehow if we put it that way, that of course the historical memory is something is probably is not, can put them together. But it's very interesting in China now is that people actually, they are very interested in United States. And they are also, if we talk about this bilateral relationship, we can say, look back during the past 10 years, this bilateral relationship has experienced a major transformation. Their foundation has been much strengthened compared with 10 years ago, 15 years ago. I'm a university professor, so I can say this change in the recent years. There are more and more Chinese students in the U.S. campus. They are, well, this weekend we organized a dialogue program between the Chinese students and Japanese students because they have tensions. So I work with my colleague Tatsushi L, professor, and we work together to have this dialogue program. So we have students from George Mason University. We ask them, how many Chinese students in your university? First, one student said 500, and then another student saying that it's over 1,000. And I know I have conducted some research. Now, today, in the US, almost each of the major state universities, they have the Chinese students number over 1,000. In 2009, this 1 year, the number of Chinese students, new Chinese students coming to the United States increased by 29%. And 2010, 25%. And if you open the newspaper, you can find many of the Chinese leaders, their sons or daughters are in the United States. So I think in my book, I also make this argument. Because basically, you can say I'm taking a constructivist approach. I'm talking about the role of history education, the role of education. But I believe following the same constructivist approach, I'm very optimistic about this bilateral relationship. Because think about it, there are such large number of the Chinese students here in the US. And also, there are more and more U.S. students went to China. So they have spent time in China. And they will have a much better understanding towards each other. And the Chinese younger generation, sometimes I was so surprised that compared with my generation, they have so even stronger historic consciousness. When I conduct this dialogue program, I'm very surprised to find out that. But at the same time, they also get exposure to the American culture or the world culture much earlier than my generation. And many of them, they come here, they spend a lot of time here. I believe change will also happen. So I think this could be a new basis or new foundation for the U.S.-China relationship in the future.
Over here again.
Hi. Okay. I'm Tyler Gibson. I'm with the Wilson Center, and I was just wondering, what do you believe the Chinese cultural notion of face plays in this historical consciousness?
Mm-hmm.
And kind of as a follow-up, how do Chinese history books portray the role of the United States in World War II? And I wanted to hear your thoughts about that subject as well. Thank you.
Why don't we take the second question over here also? And
Hi, thank you. I'm Thina Lee. I'm an intern here at the Wilson Center. So my question is, when the Chinese party, they want to build up their legitimacy on historic ground, somehow they find themselves somehow dispensable, because a lot of Chinese people right now base their identity on the historical ground instead of the partisan ground. So especially combined with the recent scandals in the party, do you think this kind of policy will backslash or have kind of boomerang effect to turn the people against the party?
Mm-hmm.
Right. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I think they are all very good questions. Face. I believe faith plays a very important role in the Chinese foreign policy. And actually in my book, I also especially talks about how historical memory narrative related with faith. Every country, because one of my important arguments in this book is that national identity determines national interest determine foreign policy. So very important part of Chinese national identity is about these historical memory issues. And also, it's based on the idea that because humiliation somehow is about losing face. So there's a strong idea in the Chinese foreign policy making is that China cannot afford losing face again. And being respected, getting respect from the international society, especially other countries showing special respect to China becomes very important. So I made this argument is that every country has national interest. Normally national interest, the components of national interest normally is our territory, our, these things, sovereignty. But for China, some of the non-material national interest, especially face, image, becomes very important, sometimes even more important than those physical material interest. For this party, for this ruling party, I think sometimes they can sacrifice the real material interest of the country to get some non-material interest, to get some face. So that is also why they have a little flexibility, especially relationship with Japan, because face is so important. Anything, even just minor thing, they were worried about the party were losing face again. And sometimes they want to use special way to make other party losing face, so make them even somehow like they get some face. For example, in 2010, when China and Japan had some tensions over the fish boat coalition, and the Chinese, I think they are intentionally to call the Japanese ambassador to the office of the foreign ministry in the midnight. It's kind of like I think they intentionally to do that. And also like this demonstration. In both cases, the reason I said that this year's demonstration very resemble with the demonstration in 1999, bombing of the embassy, is that the government actually used the demonstration to kind of like serve as a role as a punishment to other country, or to make other country losing face. So I believe you all remember the picture Ambassador Susser somehow is in this broken office frames that the embassy being damaged by the Chinese protesters. And this time the damaged Japanese made car is kind of played the role as kind of a punishment. So that is about face. And it's also a very good question about the World War II and the US-China relationship. We talked about the two countries, they probably have some bad memories, but they did have some good memories, is that during the World War II, they are fighting together. And the United States provided very important help to these two countries. So if we're going back to that questions about the foundation of the two countries, I think these good memories is a part of it. And just unfortunately, today in the Chinese official media, sometimes there's some reports, but it's not something really being reported, or it's not a part of memories the government trying to make the young people to remember of. And you asked the question about the identity towards nation and the party. I think it's very important. Yes, there could be a controversy, but I think so far one of the reasons the government, the CCP, they launched the Patriotic education campaign is that they trying to make it like that. Love the party first, and then love the country. And also their narrative is based on without the party, they will not have an independent China. Without the party, like their slogan, only the Chinese Communist Party can rejuvenate China. They want to make the idea people believe is that without Chinese Communist Party, China will go back to warlords. They will be divided. There will no any political force in China can hold China together. You must have a stronger leadership, and you can, China can be a strong country. China can have international face. China can rejuvenate it. China can be a stronger power. And I can tell you, actually today in China, many people, including many intellectuals, like almost all the students, the elite, from the elite school, I have worked with them during this dialogue programs. I found them, they also support this idea. They believe China cannot have Communist Party. Even the party made a lot of mistakes. Even the party have huge problems. But without this party, how China can be a strong nation in the world? They believe that. But also it's very important. You talked about the recent scandals, corruptions issues. I believe that would play a very important role in the future. Because when we talk about Chinese politics, I believe there is only one keyword. That is the party. And Deng Xiaoping has said many times, he believes the real threat to this regime is not from outside, it's from inside. I think he's totally correct. And the recent issue has indicating maybe there are real problems in the party. They cannot pull themselves together. Now it's, 10 years ago, the solution for them for the standing committee membership is that all the people qualified the age, the current political bureau members, everybody they qualified the age. After several people retired, they became the standing committee members. This time they had problem is that they have 9 positions, but the 11 people qualified. Look at the mass. They already like that, and they are talking about even 7 positions. So you see the internal struggles. So in the future, I believe especially another problem is currently the party becomes interest groups. Each of this, why people talk about corruptions? Because the top leaders, they somehow all became a representative of special interest groups. That is a real problem for the party. So in the future, maybe I can say this tendency is that this kind of, the loyalty, patriotism based on the nation will be more and more kind of conflict with the loyalty towards the party. If the day happen, if this conflict will become bigger and bigger, it will be a real crisis for the party.
Okay. Question up here up front.
Okay. All you say
Just a minute, please.
all you say is very good. Everything should
Identify yourself, please.
Okay, my name is Vishnu Paudel, representing National Advisory Council, South Asian Affairs. Everything you say is correct. But every day, world dynamics, paradigm is changing because of so many factors. So the real leadership is to get a right handle on what really is most interesting things for a nation to do. Now for China, to go back into the history of humiliation and all that they came here. But now, Japan is the second largest economy. Korea is a very good economy. Shouldn't they get together and move on by leaving something like nationalism, like Taiwan was handled by Mao Zedong and America? Shouldn't they do that?
Yeah, I think you're totally right that this summer I was in Asia. I was lucky to have opportunity to attend the ceremony celebrating the 40th anniversary of the founding of Singapore. And I'm not a member of that community, but I was so proud of this country. In such a short period of time, they became so successful. And I went to South Korea, and I visited the country, and I found I was also very proud of this country. They made such unthinkable achievement compared with 100 years ago when Chinese warlord Yuan Shikai was Qing government appointed governor of Korea. And during this 100 years, this country changed them so quickly. They are such advanced technology and the life there. And I went to China. I went to Shenzhen, the city very close to Hong Kong. And I was very proud of China. It's because Shenzhen is a city you say China's emerging middle class. I met some of my classmates, my relatives. I think if I told them 10 years ago, 15 years ago, their life now, they won't believe that. They have their own house, they have their own car. And one of my classmates, he lived in an apartment that every resident of the apartment from the same corporation. So I can imagine they have all the similar kind of life. It's a successful Asian story. And I think the successful Asian story is based on one thing, is that all the countries, during the last 2 or 3 decades, they focus on economic development. And they cooperate, they work together. There are a lot of Japanese companies in China, a lot of Korean companies in China. They work together. The Asian people, they're very flexible, they are very, diligent. So that's the secret of the story. But unfortunately, each of the conference I attended in this country, in Singapore, in Korea, is about the conflict of this issue, South China Sea. They are fighting for several islands. The total land put together probably is 5 square kilometers something, and they fight it for that. And Singapore, Philippines. So I think it's important. Actually, for example, between China and Japan, there's a huge potential for the two countries to work together. And they just signed an initial agreement for the economic zone. They will work together. They will, to have a much lower, threshold for the transportation and export-import. But unfortunately, they go back to history. And somehow they're like the slaves of the history. And it's so difficult to go over. And I think I think the leadership must do something. Not only just ordinary people, general public, like we're trying to organize some dialogue program. But I think the most important is that, unfortunately, the Chinese leadership, they are focused on internal issues. They have a huge domestic problems. Their leadership transition. Unfortunately, also, in Japan, there's a crisis of leadership. And they have to, both countries, they have to somehow use nationalism. Or when they have a weak government, weak leadership, the leaders are not able to take bold actions, like Deng Xiaoping, Li Guangyao, and some of the Asian leaders, which they opened the success story of Asia in 1980s. So we all miss that period of time. But it's just, I think it's very important. I think the domestic issues constrained these countries. They have a better cooperation. And I think it's very difficult for us to say the solution without the leadership, to have stronger leadership in all these countries.
Question here. Maybe we'll take 2 questions very quickly and then short answers.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Hi, my name is Leland Lazarus from CCTV, and my question was, how is China's national idea going to translate into an idea of expansionism? not only physically in, say, getting new territories or resources, but also in terms of projecting soft power, projecting a sort of cultural influence around the world. So how do you think that there might be a Chinese version of manifest destiny, if you've seen that in your research?
Can you say it again, the last part of it?
A Chinese version of the U.S. idea of manifest destiny, expanding and projecting American images around the world.
Mm-hmm. You're from CCTV? Yes. Oh, really?
Wait, one more question here. First, identify yourself,
yes,
please.
I'm sorry. My name is Lisa Dyson. I'm a student at Georgetown University in Asian Studies, and so I was wondering if, so clearly this themes of nationalism and historical consciousness, especially in China, have become sort of the unifying factor in China. Are there any other factors out there that have any possibility of challenging or supplanting, augmenting nationalism, or is it really the only one out there?
Okay.
You have 2 minutes.
Okay. Yeah, I just trying to be brief. I think, of course, that if I say the China's narrative of national humiliation or historic consciousness, it's based actually in my book, I trying to ask people, the Western readers, to be more relaxed about this idea. It's not really very aggressive, or they want to change the world. They want to change the status quo. They want to expansion. They want to build an empire. I don't think so. It's actually based on very simple idea, is China has to be a stronger and a rich country. 富强. I argued a lot about this idea about being a country of 富强. So the basic idea is that they hope their country being rich and powerful, so the country will no longer be took advantage by other countries. They will not longer be bullied by other countries. I think that is the fundamental ideas here. Of course, some people may have this idea China should be, okay, a new empire, something like that. Okay, going to your questions. Of course, for a big country like China, they must have some, if I talk about national ideas, there should be more than one. But I believe what I'm trying to do in this book is just trying to say this historic consciousness being a fundamental issue in the Chinese kind of identity forming. But of course, something else like China's culture itself. You can say in recent years more and more the traditional culture, and it's also coming back, it's also plays some very important role in the China's identity formation. And including, like I talked about, the huge number of the overseas students. So I believe China is also learning very quickly about the world culture. I see a lot of translation book of Western literature, Western philosophy, political science in the Chinese bookstores. I think they also play roles.
Thank you very much for a very interesting presentation, and thank you all for coming. Please join me in thanking our speakers.
Thank you very much. Thank you.